if you're wanting to be involved in the Q&A later on, just keep that in mind if you're going to be asking something personally and not just in the chat. Next, I just want to say a little bit about the Parkdale Free School and in relationship specifically to the land acknowledgement. The Parkdale Free School is committed to moving beyond land acknowledgements and offering classes that address decolonization, settler colonialism, and Indigenous struggles for social justice. If you'd like to be involved in these efforts, you can stick around after the session wraps up and I can talk more about what that could mean. So my name is Andrew Winsher, he, him, and I am the director of the Parkdale Free School. It's a grassroots project that supports community members and allies to share their knowledge and lived experience with a broader audience. It began as a project of the Parkdale Neighborhood Land Trust, which is a local initiative to combat gentrification in the West End by acquiring land and safeguarding it for community use. If you have any questions about either the free school or the PNLT, feel free to stick around again afterwards, and I can also answer questions about that. So thanks for joining us this evening for this conversation with Vicky concerning direct action in the context of today's homeless struggles, as well as her book, In Defense of Looting, A Riotous History of Uncivil Action. This event is co-sponsored by Another Story Bookshop, which has purchased copies of Vicky's book for those of you living in Toronto. You can call the store or order one via their website, which I'll share in the chat. Please support this really amazing independent social justice bookstore. And I just want to also plug an upcoming event that people might be interested in with Ronaldo Walcott on February 25th, which is about his book On Property, which examines the relationship between policing and property. That's happening Thursday, February 25th, 7 to 8 on YouTube and Facebook Live, and I'll share a link to that as well in the chat. I just want to plug one more event that people should know about as well. Justice for Queens Hotel is a coalition of community members and former tenants who are saying no to the proposed development of the former Queens Hotel, which is located at 1521 Queen Street West in Parkdale, where 27 tenants were unlawfully and violently evicted in 2015. The situation is the developer 6 years later has yet to replace the 27 affordable dwelling rooms as promised to make amends for the cruel displacement of community members in the neighborhood. They're now applying to the local planning approval tribunal, and basically there's an invitation to join a community coalition meeting on Thursday, February 11th from 6 to 8 to discuss that recent appeal and see how we could coordinate a community-based strategy to respond and engage in the appeal process. And I will share a link to registration. So before I hand it over to Catherine, who's going to introduce Vicky, I wanted to do something a little bit different because the Parkdale Free School is really all about community members sharing knowledge and lived experience. And before we get into the conversation, I'd like to just take about 5 minutes where I'm going to put people into large breakout rooms and just take a few minutes to introduce yourself, say what made you interested in the event, and that's really all you have time for. It's really just a chance to see who's on these calls and give just a second to to that kind of conversation. So it's going to be a large room. If you're feeling shy, if you don't want to say anything, there's no big pressure. It'll only be a few minutes, but I'm just going to do that really quickly. And just give me 1 second.
Facebook people can stand by for 10 minutes and talk to their friends.
That's right. Yeah, they'll have a different, they'll have a different experience. Okay. So it's 7:10 now. I'll get to like 7:15.
Andrew, is it possible that Eventbrite sent out a different Zoom link?
Are you getting notices about
I
anything, or?
just one person messaged me saying that they used a link that they got at 6:58.
Huh. Well, at this point, I mean, you can just send them the link. Like, it really doesn't. I could even post the
Yeah,
link on Facebook
yeah,
for. Why don't I do that? I'll post a link just in case people are having issues. It's Mercury retrograde, so I'm sure somebody is getting the wrong event or,
yeah,
feedback
some
anyway.
some ghost email.
Let's see.
Cool.
All right, so it's posted to the Facebook event, so hopefully that will help anybody who's having trouble.
Looks like we've got folks trickling in now, so maybe
Yeah,
maybe there was
great.
some
Okay.
problems with the link.
Yeah, who knows?
Classic.
I'll just give maybe 2 more minutes and then I'll bring everybody back. All right, I'm going to shut down all the rooms and bring everybody back. Oh, okay, there's a countdown of 60 seconds, so let people finish up.
Perfect.
And yeah, just from, Catherine, I'll be handing it over to you when if everybody gets back. And I'll keep an eye out on the Facebook event to just see if there's some questions that I can, forward you both.
Yeah,
But
Great.
yeah, otherwise it'll be in your capable hands.
perfect.
All right.
Okay, it looks like everybody's coming back.
All right.
Okay, and yeah, so thanks for humoring us with that, and I hope that people were able to, yeah, at least say a few words about, where they're coming from, so we're not all just boxes, just floating heads and a big screen. So yeah, with that, I'm going to hand over to Catherine, who's going to introduce Vicky. They're going to talk for about 30 minutes. I think that there's going to be a short break. And then the rest of the time is just going to be question and answer. We'll be checking the Facebook live stream, and people can also ask questions in person. So with that, I'll hand it over to Catherine.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Andrew. Do you want to take your video off too? Cool. Cool. Okay. So hi, everybody. My name is Catherine. I'm a tenant and neighbor in the Junction area of Toronto, and I have the great pleasure of facilitating tonight's event. So as Andrew mentioned, I'm going to start us off with a few questions for Vicky. Then we'll all take a 10-minute break, and then we'll return for hopefully a bunch of audience questions. So be thinking of those and sending them whenever. So to start off with an introduction of Vicky. Vicky Osterweil is a writer, editor, and agitator based in Philadelphia. Her writing has appeared in like a bunch of impressive places.
Very impressive.
And her first book was released last summer by Bold Type Books, and that is, of course, In Defense of Looting. She also co-hosts a podcast called Cerise and Vicky Rank the Movies, in which Cerise and Vicky rank all the movies.
All of them. All the ones ever made. Oh, yeah.
So, like, check that out. Cool. So, Vicky, I thought that we would start with a discussion of the term property, specifically with respect to the historical conditions of the emergence of property. So I'm going to read a few really nice sentences from your intro, and then you can take it away. So in the introduction to In Defense of Looting, you say, racial settler colonialism is at the core of all modern notions of property. All our beliefs about the righteousness of property, ownership, and commodity production are built on the history of anti-Black violence and settler colonial extraction. The right to property is innately, structurally white supremacist. So, do you want to build a bit on that, expand on that history that you're pointing to here, like as far as the mutual imbrication of the history of this continent and property as we know it?
Sure, yeah, start me off real easy. Thank you so much. No, yeah, I'm really glad to be here, everyone. Hi, thank you so much for having me and listening and joining for this conversation. I'm really excited. Yeah, the history of property. So, a lot of the, again, I'm coming from like a US context. Obviously, like a lot of the people here, so-called Canada, I imagine with Zoom, there's places all over. So a lot of my research and my knowledge comes largely in relation to the US. Some of that early colonial history is rather similar in that Canada was largely like started as sort of, as I understand it, and again, I'm not super well researched, sort of basically trapper camps and sort of like and military outposts, largely of the French, as the British sort of got pushed them sort of out of what's now the United States. But in the U.S., I think it's important to think about and talk about the way that it really centers every idea about American ideology, and with that, so much of the rest of the globe. So the U.S., like, one of the big phrases that I think is, defines, it's in the Declaration of Independence, it defines, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, right? Is like this very American concept of rights and a very like core sort of liberal concept about what a state provides, what we are given on this earth. We have these natural rights, but of course, that's a modification of a quote, and it was modified in the or not in the Constitutional Congress, the Declaration drafting. The quote originally from John Locke was life, liberty, and the pursuit of a state, E-S-T-A-T-E, the pursuit of property. So from the very beginning, there has been this sort of talking about and eliding the way in which when you talk about happiness or you're talking about freedom, you're really talking about property, right? And property is built on a lot of really intense contradictions that I can't get into all of them now. I do try to talk about in the book a bit, but like, for example, if everyone has life, liberty, and the pursuit of property, then what do you do about these indigenous folks whose property you are taking, who you like, because all treaty breaking, and there is, I mean, the history of Canada and the US is the history of treaties made and broken, right? Like violently made and violently broken. All treaty breaking is usually done on the basis that, well, the indigenous people didn't really have a notion of property in the first place. They didn't really have ownership. We learned this I learned it in elementary school. I don't know if they're still teaching it, but I learned that, like, the concept of ownership was very different. And like, they didn't really understand what the early settlers meant when they talked about owning land or whatever. That's not true. In fact, indigenous society was often much more legally and philosophically advanced than the relatively barbaric Europeans who were coming over. But this was a justification for sort of violently enforcing the law and producing the state. Similarly, as this idea of right to property develops, which again, at this point, we're 200 years into the colonial history of the US in an intense way. This is that we're talking about the 18th century here. There's this question, what do you do about all these people who are enslaved, right? Because they very clearly do not have the right to own property. In fact, they are property, right? So what ends up developing in this period, and this is sort of what I trace in the book and used to talk about looting, is that property is then very, very immediately racialized. So like, okay, well, Black people can't have property, they are property. So property is inaccessible to Black people. Indigenous people can't have property except for under the terms of settler society. So indigenous land rights and is not recognized as property as such. Therefore, like, property as such is defined racially directly in opposition to indigenous land claims and Black bodies, which is to say, it is like property is always innately racial and racialized. And this is a little complicated. Again, like, this is, I'm sort of trying to please ask questions or whatever clarity. There's so many important things to read. Cheryl Harris, Whiteness as Property. Patrick Wolf, his books on colonialism and settler colonialism. I'm pulling from 1491 here. Like, there's so many different sources on this that I won't even name all of here. But so whiteness becomes this sort of property, this uber property that certain citizens have. Early in the colonies, that literally only means Anglo and Scotch, and eventually Scotch-Irish whites in the US, who weren't white yet. They were just Anglos and Scotch-Irish, and like Jews, through the 19th century, Jews, Czechs, Swedes, Germans. These are not categories that we tend to think of as having suffered intense racial bias. They did. They were, Greeks. They weren't white. They were assimilated into whiteness over time, because whiteness is a property relation that you can be given, which gives you permission to own other property up to and including indigenous lands, real estate, and Black labor, right? The enslaved, and gives you, the rights, all other rights and all right discourse, especially in the US, but then this is then imitated in Europe and comes into Europe, and Europe likes to blame all this stuff on their settler colonies that they obviously invented. But this plays out also very, very intensely in the European colonization of Africa, and to a lesser extent, but also in Southeast Asia. So all of this is obviously a massive swath, hundreds of years of global history that I'm trying to bullshit in like 15 seconds on a Zoom call. So apologies, but the real, like, the nugget of what I think is important to take away is that the right to property, and the question of property is ultimately the right to being white and the right to whiteness, and whiteness is the ultimate property. So when we talk about abolishing private property, we also are necessarily talking about abolishing whiteness. So when you start thinking about, because I think a lot of, as we get into the, the more direct and like modern focus of this question, about housing and real estate, one of the ways that the 20th century, especially in the US, but I think this is strong in Canada as well, much stronger here on this part on Turtle Island than it was in Europe. One of the ways that consent of the governed was purchased was by giving land to settlers. So that's sort of the settling of the Old West, the opening of the West, but then also eventually the construction of the suburbs and the family home. And this also, again, sorry for introducing so many concepts all at once, but it also functions in terms of patriarchy. So like a father owns his wife and children legally at first. So there are these forms of property that are given that are all sort of derived from whiteness, from patriarchy, that then get given in different parcels to sort of win consent and win communication with a democratic polity, the United States, Canadians. So when we get to the question of housing struggle, we talk a lot about, I think very importantly, we talk a lot about land back, decolonizing, also gentrification, also, redlining, racial discrimination. All of these things are incredibly important topics. It's also important to understand that they are contiguous systems with the very notion of property as it exists on the ground. So it is impossible for there to be a more equitable distribution of property to the point of ending houselessness, of ending white supremacist violence, of ending indigenous oppression, precisely because the very notion of property is built on that contradiction. To say a whole lot really quickly, I hope that was clear. Yeah.
Oh, I think you froze briefly, at least for me there in the last part, Vicky.
Okay, yeah. Well, in any case, that's sort of like,
it's based on that contradiction.
Yes, yeah. So there is no property, and there's no egalitarian distribution of property that doesn't abolish whiteness and property itself. Like that's not an egalitarian redistribution, right? And I think you see that a lot in even in these sort of social democratic socialist states in Northern Europe, where these really intense right-wing racist policies have reasserted themselves, even though in theory there's all this egalitarianism that should like push against that, precisely because as long as property law state persists, even in these places that are relatively distantly connected from their history of colonialist imperialism, Switzerland, Sweden, right. Even there, it will reassert itself violently necessarily, because it is how property works.
Thank you so much. That was definitely, I gave you a big challenge with that opening question. So like incredible overview, and hopefully, yeah, that will give like a lot of really interesting seeds for people to sort of like engage with in questions too. So as you said, like whichever pieces of those feel compelling, we can kind of like dig into more. I want to make sure that we have enough time to cover everything that is happening in Philly. So like let's zoom forward, I don't know, what, 300 years. Yeah. And we have the Philadelphia Housing Authority among the institutions that is like, using property as a currency in order to like maintain and continue and exacerbate like the injustice of current conditions. And so do you want to tell everybody about what went down in Philly this summer? You could start with the Philadelphia Housing Authority if you wanted.
Yeah. So Philly is in America, for people who don't know, it's the poorest big city in America. I think we're the 6th largest city. We also have an incredibly low median income. It's historically, and this is not a coincidence, it is a Black majority city. It is a white minority city. It is also sort of, at the sort of intersection of a lot of these questions. Pennsylvania too often is sort of divided. It's a swing state, but there's a lot of reactionary sort of white politics in the country, and then a lot of Philadelphia is a relatively like progressive city, whatever that means, which just means which often in terms of struggle means actually there's a lot more powerful nonprofits willing to co-opt you. Reform. It's not always a benefit to have a progressive city. So PHA is the Philadelphia Housing Authority. As it exists here, they run the local, what's the word? Oh my God. Public housing here in Philadelphia. They are FEMA, technically federally managed, which the city has consistently used to distance itself from having to manage PHA politics. PHA, like any other massive government bureaucracy that has had historical power given to it as a result of past social movement, which is what has happened to these bureaucracies that have power, other than the police, which anyway, and so they're the biggest landlords in Philadelphia, bigger than Penn, bigger than the other universities here. They're the biggest landlords in Philadelphia. They offer public housing, but and they maintain it, and they're funded again by the federal government. But they have a recent history, last 20 years, of like really, really deep corruption. They have their own police force, which can pursue evictions without a court process. Although actually our movement is actually, they've lost some of that power. Like we actually took that away from them this summer, which is kind of cool. But it's still a little unclear like how much they're going to get back. That's still like live in the struggle. But like, and they have huge swaths of properties, thousands and thousands of empty homes. They have a waiting list for low-income residents that they closed access to in 2013. So no one has been able to even get on the waiting list since 2013. They have housed I don't have the numbers right at the top of my head, and I don't want to get them wrong, but just so few people get into PHA housing. And one of the things that they do is they purposely blight some of their empty properties. So one thing that can happen in housing law in Philadelphia, we're getting in the weeds here a bit, but if the roof starts to leak, that no longer becomes a safe place to live. This is like, that's the easiest way to get that, right? It's pretty common. I'm sure I lived in a leaky apartment most recently in Philly, like I think we all have. So what they would often do is they would instead of maintaining it, have a family, they would let the roofs leak, and then they would declare it unfit for habitation and evict the families, and then leave it fallow, leave it empty. There's a neighborhood here, very small, almost exclusively Black neighborhood in North Philadelphia called Sharswood, where a few years ago they eminent domained hundreds of families out of perfectly good houses in order to build a huge block. It's on the border of, sorry if this is all, again, now I'm moving very fast through real estate history in Philadelphia for people who probably aren't from here. But anyway, what they did is they basically took over a neighborhood with an eminent domain. They kicked all the people out, Black neighborhood, built a $45 million headquarters there, and are holding those properties mostly vacant. There's whole blocks, just vacant blocks. It's really blighted in the neighborhood and that neighborhood is on the border, is between two quickly gentrifying neighborhoods, Brewerytown and Fishtown on opposite sides. So they're basically waiting until the gentrification, which has been slower in Philly because it's poorer, gentrification catches up so that they can auction these homes off in blocks to developers. Okay, classic. This is classic development scheme. It just happens to happen in Philly, mostly through this thing PHA. There's something like this in your city, wherever you are. I promise it might not be government run, but I promise there's something similar going on. A big bureaucracy that empties houses, leaves them empty in poor neighborhoods, evicts people in order to resell. The reason we know a lot of that is because there has also been, over the last 10 years, a really, and more specifically the last 2, really intense campaigns, which have been for most of those 2 years very small, to investigate, expose, and reveal how PHA functions. So that's sort of my involvement in that. Now we're getting into the present history. My involvement in that sort of started in 2018 with this movement that there was Occupy ICE, which happened all over the US in 2018. People tried to shut down ICE facilities. Here in Philly, the actual ICE shutdown was pretty short-lived. The occupation moved to City Hall, where it was largely taken over by unhoused comrades, who then organized it into a housing struggle as well as an immigrant struggle. Really like incredible example of struggles coming together. We had all these immigrant groups, but also it was like mostly Black and or queer unhoused folks leading this movement. It was really, really exciting for the summer. We won these demands and we started squatting. Some of those folks, we started squatting some empty PHA houses. And then sort of in 2019, this activist, I don't know if she'd like to be called that anymore, but this person, Jennifer Bentek, started this thing called Occupy PHA, which was outside PHA's headquarters and was demanding this housing. A lot of the folks from Occupy ICE met with her in this like summer of 2019 and these unhoused folks. And we all sort of like got together. And then over the year of 2020, we started there's the group that was a Philadelphia Housing Action was the group that sort of formed out of all of that. Another PHA, which is a troll, but makes it hard to talk about. So Philadelphia Housing Action sort of started doing defenses of homeless encampment sweeps. So Philadelphia has a lot of homeless encampments, obviously, as do most major cities in the US and I imagine in Canada as well. And the city was doing these really violent sweeps. They were doing them in the dead of winter. And then there was this one big sweep that was happening, the biggest encampment in Center City, which is our downtown, which was in the convention center. It was happening the day that the stay-at-home orders came out for COVID. Okay, so the day that Philly went into lockdown, which was like 2 weeks after it should have, like true with the rest of the country, but the day Philly went into lockdown, and CDC guidelines had come out saying, do not disturb like unhoused encampments. They are safer if they stay. That day, there was a huge homeless sweep. It was brutal. It was super violent, really nasty. Because it was the beginning of lockdown, people didn't really know to come out, where they wanted to come out. Like, you know, this was still early in the pandemic. It feels like it was ages ago. It was, I guess, only 10 months ago, but also like in a different time. In the wake of that really, really frustrating experience, a bunch of activists from Philadelphia Housing Authority opened a squat. It had been being talked about for a while. They just cracked open a house owned by PHA, owned by Philadelphia Housing Authority, and put a family in it, a family of unhoused people. Over the spring, over the first few months of the pandemic, 10 houses were broken into and squatted, and families of homeless folks were put into those homes. Those people, I don't know exactly the statistics, but like those people were almost exclusively, almost entirely safe from COVID. They're all still there. They're all still in those homes. Those people have homes. Whereas a lot of the people who were evicted from the encampment and brought into shelters, mixed-use shelters, have gotten sick. So it was an effective public health measure. Also, we just took those empty homes, which were perfectly good. So one of the arguments that PHA has made classically is, listen, these are blighted homes. They're in bad shape. In bad shape. No one can live in them. They're horrible. You know, don't worry, they're empty. And so what we were doing, although it wasn't public, what was being done was demonstrating that, you know, sometimes some copper piping had been pulled out. Sometimes you had to restart reconnect the electricity. But basically, these are perfectly livable homes. These are good homes that PHA is keeping empty in order to increase the rates of gentrification. Right. So I don't know. So that's the prologue. That's the prologue to the summer. And then obviously the George Floyd uprising happened. It was massive in Philly. It was really, really powerful here in Philly. Days of looting. Cops really got defeated all over the city for 3 days, really. It was really, really powerful. In the wake of that, folks within Philly Housing Action, this group that had grown, you know, it included it was sort of a coalition of people that had organized, decided to start a homeless encampment, a politicized homeless encampment on the Parkway, which is this like very bougie central area of Philadelphia Center City. The encampment, there were debates about whether that was the way to go. Okay, it happened. That was a week after the uprising sort of heights. And then for the entire summer, because the encampment held, for the entire summer, that became the focus of a lot of this movement energy. A lot of the people who sort of were coming into being activated during George Floyd met there, organized there, I think for better and for worse. We can get into that. A second camp was opened up outside of the Philadelphia Housing Authority's $45 million complex. On a parking lot, they were trying to, a fallow ground lot, they were trying to develop into a parking lot and mixed commercial zone. We took it over, barricaded it, fought down a bulldozer, and held another camp. So there were these two homeless encampments. One of them very, very large downtown called JTD, James Haldane, after, unfortunately, one of the organizers of, one of the main core organizers from Philadelphia Housing Action overdosed a week into the protest, 2 weeks into the overdose, and died. So it's named after him. And then the other one up north was named Camp Teddy after Teddy, who was the resident, the unhoused guy who actually stood down the bulldozer. Fucking incredible, such a sweetie. Teddy's amazing. Like, just like one of them. I've never met anyone who's like, he's on every demo in Philly, like no matter what, I always see him. He's fighting so hard. So we named it after him because we love Teddy. So like that's sort of like, and then those two camps, as a result of those two camps, there was all this pressure on the city. The city kept trying to evict us. Should I stop? Do you have another question? I'm just like going.
No, this is great. This is perfect.
Okay. So because of the summer, because there was so much going on all over the country and the world, this got very little attention outside of Philly. We went public with the fact that there were squats. We thought that was going to be huge, because if y'all remember, like in the beginning of the pandemic, there was this thing in Oakland, Moms for Housing, right? That like they squatted one building and it was this huge story. So we're like, okay, we have like 15 houses. Like this is going to be crazy. Like, but we're going to go public. We're going to let them know that we're doing that. And like, it just kind of got lost in the shuffle of a crazy summer of uprising.
Yeah.
So basically what has, so Philly right now has the largest squatting movement since the 90s in the United States ongoing. You would not know this. Like in terms of like sheer number of houses held and like openness of the squats, like obviously there's always squatting going on everywhere in the world. It's like, it's constantly going on. It is a strategy people need to use to live when they're empty buildings. But like there is like this really actively organized squatting movement right now in Philly that isn't getting talked about. Basically through a combination of eviction defense. So the city threatened to evict the camps because they were an eyesore, and rich people hated looking at homeless folks on their stroll to the Whole Foods, which is right next to the encampment. People didn't want, these rich people didn't want to have to think about the existence of homeless people. So there were all these complaints. So there were these sort of threatened evictions from the city. And every time they threatened an eviction, a bigger crowd showed up, which was the mix of like people from the neighborhoods in Sharswood, more classic activists, nonprofit types, Black Bloc, anarchist people, just like, and everyone who'd been activated in George Floyd. So there were these mass gatherings. City never pulled the trigger, never evicted. And eventually what happened was the city negotiated with the camp, and there was a lot of drama about this. Like, this is not necessarily liked by everyone, including people in the original PHA. Like the original Philadelphia Housing Action broke apart. There was a lot of drama, and we're gonna talk about that too. Like, this shit was not personally pleasant for people. There was a lot of there was some ugly stuff going on, but the city negotiated with people from the encampment, and it was voted on. It was decided by general assemblies of folks at JTD to disband in the camp in exchange for 50 extra PHA homes that were currently available. They've been transferred to a land trust that PHA is now, Philadelphia Housing Action now runs completely independently. We also have an oversight. We also have oversight over how PHA operates, and we'll get into the nitty gritty of how that worked. But a lot of what happened was really, really intense research and understanding of the city bureaucracy, and turning PHA, which is this sort of federally funded organization, turning it against the city. Because the city disavowed, they were like, well, we don't. So basically, by causing drama between these two branches of Philadelphia city government, we put all this pressure, and they couldn't unify and crush us. Because excuse me, materially, they could have driven us out. We never had enough force to actually really hold a concerted police attack. But politically, after the uprising, everyone wanted to look. No one wanted to be the Mayor Kenny didn't want to be the white mayor who evicted the black homeless encampment, but also like they're just like, there wasn't a political ability to do it. But also because we created that pressure, basically PHA caved first because the land around Camp Teddy, which is the smaller camp next to their headquarters, they had a development deadline or they were going to lose funding. So when that deadline came up, they panicked and they gave us 15 houses, like completely separate. They gave us, I think, 10 houses. They gave us oversight. They gave us lawyers who are going to create the land trust for us. They gave us the official land. Like they just gave everything
To
completely
get
rolled
people
over
off of the parking lot.
just to get people off this future parking lot. Yeah.
Not
It wasn't even yet a
parking
parking
lot
lot. Yeah. It was a grassy field. And there were like 10 people living there and like 20 other people there regularly hanging out like that. So yeah, I guess I'll stop there. We'll get into some more specific questions. But PHA kind of caved first. Then the city felt embarrassed. They caved. They wanted to be seen to be like doing the right thing. Now we're in this ugly period where, because the movement sort of fell apart in some ways, the city might be able to pull back some of these promises because the pressure has been relieved. And what always happens when the pressure is relieved is that like bureaucrats try to backtrack. But in my opinion, there was this punching well above its weight, incredibly powerful housing and homeless-led movement in Philadelphia that made huge wins and that like sparked off a wave of squatting that has been successfully defended for a year. That's where we're at.
That's a pretty awesome place to be at.
Yeah,
all things considered.
I think it's going well. I've never been part of a thing that like Occupy ICE, like in 2018, like we had some wins and we had the squat, and like that eventually fell apart. But like, I don't think I've ever been part of something that has won on a scale like this, on a scale of real policy that has like sort of got demand wins. And I don't think anyone has. And I think that's part of why there's been so much drama, actually, because I think people don't know how to handle now, how to move. And, there was a lot of like, there was some difficult stuff. Like, I mean, anyone who's done work with a homeless encampment like knows that like folks they bring the drama with them. Like, it's not just like super like, there's drug use, there's like violence, there's difficulty, there's like lots of stuff that's like, I mean, not that there's anything wrong with drug use, except that sometimes people get really high and act crazy, act weird. That's the only problem with drug use. There's nothing wrong with it otherwise, except that like when you don't have a private place to do it, when you're like living outside, like sometimes that creates conflict. There's so, and it's also expensive. If it was free, it wouldn't be a problem, but it's expensive. So people are hustling as well. There's all these problems. There's all these things going on and then to win something weirdly suddenly, yeah. I think, but also in a way that like wasn't. It was negotiated. The win was sort of negotiated in a way that was like, for me personally, like I never went to those meetings with the city. I don't think I wasn't invited. Like, I'm saying we, like, whatever. I was not that central in most of this stuff. Like, I'm connected to people who are very central. My attention and my stuff was elsewhere. I was spending a lot of time at the camp, but I wasn't in the ins and outs of all this stuff. So yeah.
Well, that's an interesting like place to go from here, I think, of like, it seems like one of the surprising parts of this summer, and then also like one of the maybe powerful pieces or effective pieces of things, was combining the sort of being at the camp and the direct action on the ground. There's a bunch of tactics within that we can like get into more specifically, but like combining that with this like being in the boardroom, like doing negotiations, like, and those are like different theories of change, that like, what does it look like to have those functioning in tandem? And yeah, the like, how are then individual people going to like relate to those two things? So I'm thinking also of your comrades talking on the It's Going Down podcast. So there's a few Philadelphia Housing Action people who talk there. For others who are interested in hearing more, I definitely recommend that. And they were saying like, from the perspective of people being in those boardrooms, like they had never been in that position before. And in fact, that had been really like their approach.
Right.
as you say, energy in different places. So yeah, do you want to talk about what it looked like to have both of those things going at once? I know, like you said, your energy was more at the camps, and the camps themselves, like there were blockades that were happening. There were all sorts of different tactics that were being used. How does it all?
Yeah, so no, I mean, that's a really interesting question. We got lucky this time in that the people who were in those meetings, who went into those meetings, were really, really intransigent, angry, brave people who weren't going to cave. Because I think for the most part, the people who would have wanted to go into those rooms would have done a bad job. And in fact, like, and this isn't like no shade on these people, but like some younger activists like went into those spaces, went into those rooms and came out being like, oh, we should take this deal, like we should take this deal, and had to be sort of talked down like, no, like the deal is bad, like, and like, I think, talked about Jen. Jen spent 10 years unhoused herself, or 7 years unhoused herself in Philadelphia. We always had unhoused people like in the meeting. I think that was really important. If you yourself have been unhoused, or if you know unhoused people, you know that they are used to empty promises. The city and the nonprofits and all of these services promise them something and never follow through, or it's not actually what they said it was. So that has a mixed effect. Sometimes it makes people very successfully stubborn in the way that you need. Sometimes it makes people willing to grab anything also, right? It does make people desperate as well. Obviously, it's not, there's no one way that this goes. Anyway, I actually think, interestingly, one of the biggest problems that the movement faced was a lack. So I described a lot of different things. There were a lot of things. There were 2 camps. There was squatting. There were these eviction defenses that like often led to growing the infrastructure physically, building barricades. But actually, almost failed, I think, because it stalled out really hard on focusing on the camps internally. One of the things that a lot of people, and here I really mean people positioned like myself, who are housed and who like aren't directly affected by this question, and who are coming into the camp to sort of whatever help somehow. And they all intended to help somehow. I want to be clear, this is not about anyone's intentions. A lot of what people end up doing in these struggles is reproducing nonprofit shelter mentality. People don't think of unhoused people as political actors in their own right. They think of them as the object of their solidarity, someone who needs to be protected and pitied and taken care of and helped, like they have mental health problems. So obviously they can't make decisions, right? It's like, no, like I also have mental health problems. Like I just happen to like have a home and like be white. So like I got lucky and like I have a job, like whatever. Like we all have mental health problems. Like it's 2021, girl. Like what the fuck? Like we're all losing it. Like, and like, but like, or like, oh, like they're drug addicts, so they can't think for themselves. It's like, I know you spend most of your money on weed. Like I know, like I've been to your house, like I've smoked a bong with you. Like I know about it. Like we just can do it in private, right? Like, so I think like one of the real fundamental boundaries to this kind of work is that activists, leftists, revolutionaries, whatever you want to call them, who want to help genuinely still dehumanize Black people and dehumanize homeless people, they do it. And like, it's hard. And that means that what ends up happening in these encampments, and I've seen it happen, I saw it in 2018, I saw it again this year, or 2020, what happens is that what they end up doing is thinking that they need to organize the space, AKA create a bureaucracy, create a government, manage it, create a security team, create whatever. They need to manage it because it's too chaotic. It's too chaotic, which it is. It's too anarchic, which like if you said that to them, they'd be like, no, I like anarchy, but whatever. But some of them would, I guess, some of them wouldn't. Whatever. So a lot of people spent a tremendous amount of energy trying to control the encampment, and that was so hard. If those people had spent half as much energy reaching out to people who weren't already in the encampment, distributing like working on the demands, politicizing the demands, talking about it, developing the demands, developing the politics of the space, or going on marches. Like, so there was a protest encampment in Philly for 3 months. Part of the reason that it didn't make a big splash is because we didn't go on that many marches. Now, some of the reason was because in the wake of the George Floyd uprising, there was a month of increasingly senseless large marches that people got really frustrated with. I understand like marching isn't really super effective, but like, you know, like one thing that happened out of Camp Teddy, which was much smaller than JTD, and they ended up being relatively politically different, actually.
Right.
Teddy, you know, they would constantly take these walks to the houses of the PHA CEO, members of city council, and they would stand outside their houses at night and just scream and yell and do a protest like at their house in their neighborhood, right? That freaks people out. Like they don't like that, you know? The CEO of PH, like Kelvin Jeremiah did not like when we rolled up into his bougie neighborhood and his fucking, you know, $3 million house or whatever it is, and fucking started hollering. Like it's not, they don't want that. And so like, so pressure like that, like didn't really happen actually. And what that meant was that the necessity pushed towards the negotiations.
Right.
Because there wasn't pressure building from the camp. The camp itself was pressuring, you know, like I said, rich people didn't like it, PHA didn't like it, but the camp itself, like pressure didn't build so much. So then it like sort of moved into the negotiating rooms with the city, with PHA, and then people didn't like that. I also don't like that. I tend to not like that. I don't want to talk to the city. Like I said, I didn't participate in it. Then when things moved there, a lot of people felt really burnt, felt really, really betrayed. Even people in the original, you know, in the original organizing cluster who like had been there from day one, felt really burnt and betrayed by the people who like went into those conversations, by the way it went down, which is what happens, which is how that stuff works, right? And what scares me the most is that like what ended up happening was like some of the angriest, most obstinate, fucking like badass people I've ever met went into those meetings, fought it out, won the fight, are still pushing for it, but now they kind of run this nonprofit land trust. And like maybe in a year, maybe in 10 years, eventually that nonprofit land trust is going to be just another lefty service that's actually fucking people over. It is inevitable. It is like the form, it is the structure of the way these things work. So I understand that critique, like you don't want to move into that space. Also, we have 60 houses in Philadelphia that we're putting previously unhoused people into permanently. But then the nonprofit becomes a landlord, right? Then it becomes liable. Then it has to manage all this shit. There's problems with this. There's problems with this approach. It's temporary. It's insufficient. But I think what the lesson of the summer was for me, really was squatting works if you can figure out how to do it. You got to have research though. You have to have someone who like understands the ins and outs of some property law, which is really boring and like no one wants to. So if you don't want to do that, or you don't have someone in your collective who wants to do it, talk to people in other movements who have done it. People have done it, and there are people around from the 80s and 90s squatting movement. They're still around. Like research it, look into your personal city. They're still here. They're still alive. They've got lots of advice to give you. It'll be really helpful. Be humble, ask, and research. We happen to have two people in the main organizing collective, one of whom did it professionally, and one of whom has spent a decade fighting personally against PHA. And so they both had this really incredible level of knowledge of all this stuff. That was really, really vital. And you're not going to just spontaneously have a person like that everywhere you go. It's just not going to happen. So, but you can build that knowledge together. So you have to take it seriously. So like those questions of like that knowledge, like, because like, okay, so one thing that would happen, right, is like the cops would get called to one of our squats. Okay, so the cops would show up. They'd be like, "You can't be here. This isn't your property." And one of our organizers would show up at the squat and be like, "No, no, no. Here's the law. Here's the deal we have. I'm calling the cops on you. The cops. I'm calling the other cops on you." Like, which again, calling the cops is weird, but it was like a bluff, or not a bluff, like it was happening, but it was this thing where like, so then the beat cop would be like, "Oh fuck, like I gotta call my sergeant," or like the sergeant has to call back to the station, like I don't know what's happening, and you create confusion and difficulty, and then they back off because actually you're in the right. Like you have this legal, like, oh, they have to observe this legal process. And like, if you have that knowledge and you have that bravery to go into the face of the police and be like, fuck off, you are wrong. Like, and I will like prove it using even your own authority, you know? That's one thing you can do. It's a tactic. It's one thing you can do maybe in your city. These are all like things that can work. But like, I think the hardest thing about movement is like, you need to have as many fronts as possible. You need to be pushing. If I've learned like, whatever, this is a personal opinion, 10 years of the shit. In my experience, as soon as you stop expanding the places you're attacking or fighting or pushing, as soon as you decide your occupation, your encampment, your organization, your demands are the only thing, and they need to be defended. What we have now, we needs to be defended. As soon as that becomes the mindset, the movement has started to collapse, in my experience. So, but it's also very, very hard to push against that because obviously, oh my God, we have this new exciting thing. We have this encampment. Like, let's work it out. Let's figure it out. Let's figure out how to do it. Like, okay, like I get that impulse. So yeah, I don't know if that was an answer.
That was amazing, and I'm really glad that you like were offered us like what you're taking away from this, because it's like it feels like a win in lots of ways. It's been celebrated as a win online in lots of cases, and it's also like unfinished and also was messy. And so like, yeah, to know what's next for the next messy summer or winter or whatever is so crucial. So I feel like this is a good moment to maybe take our 10-minute break.
Right.
I feel like there's so much fodder for hopefully some really good questions. And yeah, I know that we have a lot of people who do a lot of rad different kinds of work on this call and on the YouTube. So I'm really excited to hopefully like get into some of the more like nitty gritty of this like tactical stuff.
Awesome. Yeah, I'd be happy to. I hope I can help. I'm sure y'all know better than I do, but I'm also excited to hear from you guys. So
Totally.
From people here. Yeah. That's the best part of doing these calls. I know what I think. It's fucking, I'm tired of it. Like, I mean, I'm glad to share it, but you know, so.
Okay, awesome. Well, we're not tired of you, Vicky. So we'll all be back.
Give it time. Give it time.
Okay, see you in 10. So maybe we can do a interlude while the break is still happening, because somebody, shout out Ariel, posted a film about squatting in Philly in the 80s. So I feel like that's,
Oh, is that Takeover?
let's see. I'm just, oh wait, sorry.
Is it the Takeover? I was looking for that movie today, actually. That's so cool.
I have to send it. Here we go, everyone.
Oh my God, that's so cool.
It is really cool.
Let's see this thing. Oh.
Water is the other filter. So you know another squatting movie.
Yeah, there's a few. They're hard to find, but there are some out there. I was also like I'm working with like with the friends to like build a resource guide list thing, which I wish I had finished for today. I don't. But maybe if you still have the MailChimp for the event, we can like send it out in the next few days sometime. There's lots of movies. There's lots of cool stuff.
That's awesome. Cool. Okay, well, I feel like we can sort of pick back up. Let's see. Well, we had a question from earlier from Facebook, it looks like, that was just somebody commented, I missed why the housing authority wants to keep the units empty. It is quite counterintuitive without a sense of how real estate speculation works. So do you just want to touch back on that briefly while we're waiting for some other questions?
Absolutely. So keeping it empty does in this context mostly works. What it does is it blights a neighborhood, which means that property values go down. So if they have people living in those houses, low income people, they're getting some rent from it. They're getting some rent that they're getting from HUD. But if the real estate value goes down, they can then auction off these huge bundles of land for to developers at way more, like at market value. So they are legally obligated to sell at market value, like they can't just like cut a deal or whatever. But if market value goes down, then they can sell these huge bundles. They get the cash, right, into the organization. They don't have to manage the building. They don't have this problem anymore, which is trying to house and manage a building. And then the developers can use it to gentrify, which then drives prices up in general across the whole neighborhood and eventually city, and indeed like country. And this is happening everywhere. So that's one reason you would keep it empty. Another is if, for example, you had a specific development project you wanted to achieve, having the value on the books but not having to operate it can, like, and this is again like very specific, like sometimes that's good for your capital to like have all this, like you own all this property that's worth a lot, but you're not spending any money to maintain it. Like that can put you in different categories of like of taxes and of sort of like certain kinds of benefits you get. And this will change organization by organization, city by city. There will be some places where it's not valuable to keep them empty, but in a poor neighborhood, in Philadelphia, it makes sense to keep a large block of empty houses, because then you can actually drive the prices down enough that you can sell them to the vulture capitalist, developers. You can make it cheap enough for them to be interested to come into this otherwise undesirable neighborhood and build luxury condos, right? So basically, it's a dance between PHA or whoever the owner is of public housing and developers like, get the market price down to this and we'll think about it. Like that's kind of what's going on. So empty houses help push that. It's also just in terms of like, if you're thinking like a capitalist, a house with a family in it, you can't sell at a drop's notice if the budget changes. You gotta evict them. There's like a legal problem, like maybe they're allowed to stay. It's like a fucking pain in the ass. Whereas an empty building, no problem.
Right, it makes it more liquid.
It's liquid, exactly. It's liquid capital for you, exactly.
So on the note of I think, oh, actually, I don't have to make up my own question or decide on my own. We have some coming through. Maybe I'm doing this wrong and people are raising their hands. I'm sorry. Is there a Q&A function? I'm just gonna.
Yeah.
Okay, well, let's go with this, and I'm going to figure out the Q&A function while you
Right.
answer. So this is from somebody. I'm probably out of date on my knowledge of Philly, they say. I know its public sector, other than the cops, was pretty broke. Is that part of the context that gives organizers leverage? Also, does having a progressive DA help?
Larry Krasner, to answer these in reverse order, Larry Krasner is our progressive DA. No. In short, no. In a long form, kind of. like there's ways it has. For example, I think the main way having a progressive DA has helped is that the cops hate him. They fucking hate him. So when they arrest protesters, they just catch and release. They don't pursue charges because they don't want to like have to deal with his office. So like that kind of helps. There's been like a lot of really reactionary ADAs have been pushed out as a result. Assistant DAs have been pushed out by people in his office. There has been some good stuff. It doesn't help on this movement level. This summer, he referred to looters and rioters as animals, I think is what he said, thugs. The office changed him. He didn't change the office, right? Like that, like it is not, it's been 4 years now that he's been in, I think, 4 years since Krasner's been in. And after some early reform and some occasional conflict between the DA and the police, it has sort of helped. It has not helped to the point that the energy that was required to make it happen, I think, was justified. And I think the people who are critiquing that campaign at the time were right to do so. That said, I don't know. It hasn't been actively worse than having a reactionary DA. In terms of like public sector and being broke, the city is not as broke as it used to be. It is still, for a major city, it has a much smaller operating budget. Most of the wealthy people live outside the city limits. They live on the main line to the north or in Jersey. There are increasing gentrified neighborhoods in Center City and in Fishtown and North Philly that are something of a tax base that has been driven largely but has also been driven by a tax abatement that's been given, abatement given to developers. So there's like this 10-year property tax abatement that's been like driving gentrification here. So the city protests a lot of brokenness. They are not nearly as broke as they were in the 90s or the 2000s when that narrative developed. They are not, and again, like, I don't know how this is all related to COVID. Like, I don't know what's going on with this, but like, there is money. There's money in the banana stand, like there's money in Philadelphia city government. And it's not, it's not New York or even, or Boston or something. It's not like that, but there's more money for services than they use, and they continually raise police budgets. And they put a lot of money into the Office for Homeless Services, which we haven't talked about tonight, which is another major enemy of the movement, because, and this is probably true in your city, this is true in your city, wherever you are, we tend to think of unhoused people as chaotic, as having lives that are off the grid, right? Somehow, this is sort of the idea. There's sort of like, they don't have a home, they don't have like a tax, they can't vote, whatever. They don't participate in civic life. Yeah. This is the opposite of true. They are the most surveilled and controlled people in our society, other than prisoners. They, like, every single thing they try to do involves interaction with a series of nonprofits and bureaucracies that have increasingly like silly. So for example, one thing that can happen, there's a housing program for addicts who are clean, right? Okay, so you need to prove that you were addicted to drugs and that you no longer use them. And then you can be put in a house where you're constantly being tested for drug use, right? Where this is constantly being monitored. Okay, so there's a COVID hotel thing in South Philly. There's a shelter, temporary shelter that has been in place for the last few months. We heard about someone got kicked out 2 weeks ago because he had a marijuana cigarette in his pocket. This is his home. He's coming home to where he lives, right? And they were searching, they're frisking people for drugs in their home. Like if you were getting frisked for drugs every time you came home, you'd probably get busted and you'd lose your home if that was the condition of your housing. I imagine many of the people on this call. I certainly would. But then the next week there was a COVID outbreak there. They had the thermometer. They had that thermometer. They weren't using it at the door. So they were checking people for drugs and weapons, and they weren't testing them for COVID. This is the kind of treatment that happens. Constant surveillance. And so some of the people who are like, most unhoused people don't live outside 24/7. They couch surf, they have sort of some places that are partially sheltered. They go in and out of shelters or like temporary housing. But like, so the solution is either you go fully off grid, 24/7, totally no access to services, nothing, or the most intense and rigorous surveillance that the city can offer. Like those are your options when you're unhoused. And like, okay, like one thing that happens, like we talked about the PHA waiting list, right? Okay, so you went on a waiting list in 2013 for low income housing, right? You gave them a phone number. You can't keep your phone bill like month to month. You can't guarantee it. They call you in 2019 and twice and they don't reach you, and then you're off the list. 6 years you waited, but like you if you didn't remember to update the phone number that this random bureaucracy you applied to years ago, like if you like this kind of shit, like no one is organized enough to make this work.
Yeah,
let alone someone who's housing insecure. No one is organized enough. So these levels of like surveillance and bureaucracy like really, really intensely affect how stuff is possible. Now I've gone off on a rant and I forgot what the original question I was speaking to was.
Was about the city being broke and the leverage.
Right. Yeah. So there's money for so homeless services, OHS.
Money to surveil homeless people, I guess.
There's plenty of money to surveil homeless people. There's money for shelters. There's all these empty, like one of the things that happened, it was really obscene. The city bought a Holiday Inn at the beginning of the pandemic. They just bought it. They just bought this Holiday Inn. They had all this money. They bought a Holiday Inn. They never filled it to the capacity for COVID. The waiting list, like they were like, there was this big news story, like we bought a hotel for unhoused people during COVID. And like, it was so hard to find out about it, to get into it. Like stuff like that is like, there's plenty, in short, there's plenty of money. They always beg that there isn't enough. They are much less broke than they were. They're still poor for a big city, but that's not, there's hundreds of millions of dollars in a police budget that could just really quickly go to people being housed.
Yeah, and I'll add to that a couple of things. I think that sometimes it maybe depends on what kind of negotiations you're engaged in, because sometimes a broke municipality is that much more desperate to sell off big parcels of land that they own to developers as a revenue source. And then I'll also just say or recommend, I guess, Jackie Wong's book, Carceral Capitalism, because I think like that's just such a brilliant analysis of the relationship between municipal politics and finance capitalism that really takes like this conversation and like squares it kind of like as far as just like there's the question of looking at sort of what is a city budget balance sheet and what are they spending on the cops or homeless services and this and that and how can we exert pressure, but then there's also like who owns their debt and how is the city accountable to those people who own the debt. So that's such a big like question. But yeah, Jackie Wong, Carceral Capitalism, for anyone who wants to go deep.
Totally. And it's a really important question, like how we're going to put pressure on, because like, so far we haven't had the big eviction wave that we've been all anticipating because it keeps being pushed back. That deadline keeps being pushed back. The economy hasn't fully collapsed while employment has. This is like the first time. It's a really strange, ever since 2008, all the rules that dictated the 20th century like haven't really applied. Like unemployment and debt continue to grow, but like the economy hasn't totally bottomed out because like only the top 20% of people are really consumers anymore, and so much capital is financialized and like global. So we're in this really weird moment. To me, a person who is interested in these things but is hardly an expert or with professional experience, it seems like the bottom has to fall out in a bigger way soon. And then the question of like pressure on cities is going to become like even more direct. Like, can we stop evictions? Like, how do we stop evictions? How do we put pressure enough to do that? That is also something that we can look to in the US. Like during the Great Depression, there was a huge unemployed people's movement that successfully stopped evictions in a number of major cities, largely stopped them in others, like 100% eviction moratoriums in Detroit and Chicago, like basically 75% in New York, Boston, DC. Like it's possible, it can be done. People talk about, oh my, your grandparents, like, they survived the Depression. They didn't survive it through like stoicism and patriotism. They survived it because like a bunch of Black communists like got organized into unemployed people's councils and fucking shut down eviction courts, right? Like, so like that's not, to understand these narratives of like how we survive, and like we do have to like learn about fighting and direct action in that way. I think that question really points to, and we do have to be thinking about.
Awesome. Okay, I think I figured out the hand
Amazing
raising mechanism. I'm going to ask this person to unmute, and then they can ask their question. So yes, Alexa.
Hi, yes. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Thanks so much, Vicky. It's been super interesting to hear you talk about what's going on in Philly. I was really surprised to hear that, and I guess this is why local laws make such a difference, that having a leaky ceiling can be a cause of being able to shut down a building. And that's, in my experience, and most of the time I actually spend in the UK, the housing stock is just so dilapidated, and it's appalling, really. And so a lot of the housing movement is about trying to get better conditions, like being angry at the housing associations or social and private landlords for the mold, for the windows that don't work, for this or that. And I was wondering if there was any part of not only demanding housing for unhoused people, but sort of building strategic alliances with people who are fighting to have better, safer homes as part of what's been going on, or if that's on the horizon.
Yeah, that's a great, thank you so much, Alexa. And yeah, like that, I actually lived in the UK for a few years. And yeah, it's very different. I mean, the UK just has a much bigger stock of public housing, much bigger public housing stock that is sort of maintained by the state. So I think those questions do come up a bit more because there are a tremendous number of people in public housing in the US, and there are pushes for that housing to be improved. What we saw through the 90s and the 2000s was like a lot of times the big tower blocks got knocked down and they got replaced with sort of like these quick built neighborhoods of low income housing, was one thing that happened in the US as part of that sort of movement to improve quality of housing. I certainly think it makes sense to connect all of these. I'm really glad you brought this up because I think it makes so much sense to connect all of these issues, because when I was talking about just now on my little thing about how surveilled the unhoused are, it's so important that like one of the things that's really interesting about the way houselessness functions in society is it's where all of these different topics meet, right? So it's like, it's quality of life, which is like what you're pointing to, and it's like quality of housing, like how good is it where you're living, and it's about racial discrimination, government surveillance and private surveillance, like property, all of these questions, like they all are so interconnected and unified. And I think like part of what made the movement powerful in Philadelphia was precisely that we had this sort of tactic of encampments and this tactic of protest, and also just direct housing occupation, just direct squatting. And so I think, yes, like absolutely, like it makes sense to like connect those things. Also, like I think in America, often that's complicated by the fact that like people who are mostly tenants living under bad conditions, they have to organize against their landlord, right? And so those are the conditions they're fighting in. But then also you have people all over the country who like technically have inherited a house, but it's in terrible condition too, right? There's all these different questions like come up through housing. And I think it is really important to recognize them as interconnected, and to recognize houselessness as like the to also see like unemployment and houselessness as ways that we are those of us who are housed and employed are disciplined, right? There's this constant threat. Like, would you keep going to work if your landlord couldn't evict you? Like, I know a lot of people, myself included, who've had jobs we would have quit years earlier than we did if we didn't have to pay rent, right? But if we don't pay rent, we end up on the street, right? Like these questions all interconnect, and they all interconnect through the question of property, and for us, for those of us who rent and work, and you know, they also connect through the level of wage, of the wage. So like the wage and property, and like, yeah, all this stuff is interconnected, and it does need to be, you know, I mean, I remember in the UK, I guess I don't remember the year now, but there was the Grenfell tragedy where there was that tower. I don't know if folks outside of the UK know about this, but there was this public housing tower that they had like cut this really basic cost on, really relatively low cost, and had put flammable cladding up the sides of the house of this building, 15-story building, I think it was, and it caught fire and went up like a piece of kindling. And it was horrible. So many dozens of people died, were killed in this fire. And it was like this sort of question of like it was public housing, right? That got killed. And there was a identical tower 3 blocks over that had been privatized that had flame resistant, the same cladding, flame resistant, right? Like, so like, it's like, these questions are like all super interconnected. Obviously, like, and the public housing in London was mostly BME, which means Black and minority is what they say in the UK for that. So anyway, yes, thank you, Alexa. It's really important to like keep focused. It's really important and really hard to like both stay focused on the specific and recognize all of its connections out into all these other big questions.
That's awesome. I'm so happy to be like communing with people from all over, because
So cool.
I think it's really instructive, like the actually kind of parsing out these nuances, as somebody earlier said, like the local laws really do make a big impact. And so you know, there's only so much that's going to apply from another municipality, say, but those differences are like are very instructive, I think. We have a great question from Stuart. Do you think the squat experience provides lessons for when the bottom finally does fall out, the economy tanks, and the eviction wave starts?
Yeah. So I mean, one of the things that's happened is that like people in our collective, not as many as we would like, but we're working on it, have learned basic plumbing and electrical skills. Have learned like to be relatively fearless in the face. Have learned to identify from the outside houses that are that are owned by the city, houses that are sort of abandoned. So one thing that's been very hard in the U.S., it's a lot easier to squat public owned than private owned. This reminds me of a sort of, sorry for this funny story from some Italian comrades I met like a decade ago, who were like coming over and they were talking about squatting in, you know, I think they were in Naples. They're talking about squatting in Naples. They said, okay, so you take the squat over, knock on the door, you open it up, it's the police, the Carbonari. Great, you know, you've got months, you can fight them in court. Knock on the door, you open it up, it's the mob, you get the fuck out, right? Like, so there are these questions of like, you know, like private ownership can sometimes be more difficult to squat. But like, in short, absolutely. I think we should be taking as much as we can for people who need it. There are so many empty buildings, and we could house, you know, with the current empty housing stock in this, we could house 5 times as many unhoused people as there are in the US, without even talking about second homes, without even talking about commercial, without even talking about dilapidated, like literally just empty good housing stock. There is so much, and it is unjust, and it is criminal, and there is no reason that any house should stay empty when anyone sleeps on the street. And I think anyone is justified in doing what they can to make sure that doesn't happen. That's only going to get more intense, that contradiction. So yeah, it is a solution. It's a hard one sometimes. It helps to have a lot of local knowledge. It helps to have a movement or a group of organizers you can work with. But squatting emerges because it makes sense, immediate sense. And you know, like I was talking to sort of an old comrade about this, and like this is like, so like the existence of capitalism, right? Like depending on how one of the early moments in capitalism is what's called the Enclosure Acts in England, right? Where they turn former agricultural communes, they turn them into private land, and then suddenly the peasants have to pay rent through selling their goods to market instead of just living on their land. So they get evicted, they get made homeless, they go to the cities, they become workers, right? This is classic Marx, right? Early history of capitalism. But what one of the things that means is that homelessness, houselessness doesn't really exist until capital. It is a necessary condition of capitalism. One of the first things capitalism does is make people homeless because it has to, right? This is like, whatever. I'm not, this is like I'm not arguing for return to feudalism, obviously, but like this is one of these like really important moments that capitalism cannot coexist with a world where everyone is housed and safe. It can't. Like from its birth, it is making people homeless and impoverished and enslaved and genociding people through settler colonialism from its birth, and it's killing the planet too. Obviously,
By the way.
not to put too fine a point on it, but yeah. So in terms of like the question of housing, I think this world is obscene that has so many houses empty and so many people without them. This world that has people who have to work 80 hours a week to stay in a house that sucks, I think is obscene. Or indeed 40, or indeed 30. The fact that anyone has to work to stay indoors is an obscenity against which we should all be fighting as hard as possible. Of course, whatever. Those comments are very easy to say, very hard to live. We all also need to take care of ourselves and exist in our everyday world and survive. So that is not to guilt trip anyone, but rather to say, absolutely. We need to be creative. We need to be open-minded and creative about the solutions to these problems that are coming. And we need to look to the history of previous movements and see what they've done. Squatting in the 80s and 90s, eviction defense and unemployed organization in the Great Depression, squatting more recently. We need to look at these questions, and we also need to invent new ways to fight, because every day that goes by when there are people homeless on the street is a day that the world has been made worse, not better.
So eloquent. Andrew, did you want to add on something?
I did, yeah. I'll be quick, but Vicky, when you're talking about, just vacant buildings sitting empty and the kind of rage that comes up, I couldn't help but think of just the exciting work that's going on in Toronto by the Ontario Coalition Against Poverty. There's actually a couple people on the call from that group that are working on a really exciting campaign, for those who don't know it, to try to get a specific property on Sherbourne, which is kind of like in the east downtown core. There's been this, it's one of these properties has been sitting empty. Landlord can't go ahead. It used to house people, and there's a whole campaign to get it expropriated by the city, get it returned, and start turning those kinds of buildings into housing. And that piece around expropriation, I just find really exciting. Like it feels like a real step forward in terms of really, we need to take this empty property and give it to people so they can be housed. So I'm going to put that a link to that campaign in the chat.
Yeah, awesome. And OCAP also has a really awesome history of actions like that. So I really recommend that people do reading or talking to your OCAP comrades if you're not aware of those histories. It makes me feel so much better living in this city to know about the traditions that, we can hopefully continue on. So I noticed a couple of comments in the chat that are questions rather that are along the lines of, so what do we do? How do we get out there? We're in a lockdown right now in Ontario. And I think, that's a question that could be answered forever and ever. So I'm somewhat wary of diving all the way in, but it's just since you mentioned that you had comrades who were learning like electrician skills and plumbing skills, that honestly came to mind. These kinds of like survival skills and capacity to like have autonomy around creating your own like housing situation seems to me like a great first step. I don't know, what's electrician YouTube like, you know? Probably cool. And then the other thing that I would just suggest is maybe for anybody who is interested in just looking up what an affinity group is maybe would be my like kind of 101 suggestion to that answer, and starting to talk with just the people around you who you already trust. I don't know if Vicky wanted to like throw anything on top of that. I think you've already given a lot of good suggestions of like how to get involved.
Yeah, no, I think the thing that's really crucial, and I think a lot of activists don't like to admit, is like, we're not special people. They like to say like we're everyday people, but like they don't believe it. They think they're like called, you know, like from on high. They're like pure, you know, they're sort of these like holy people who have like emerged from like, I'm just some give me, you know, my perfect day. Like I'm hanging out with my partner watching a horror movie. Like I'm not like some fucking zealot. So like we like people, it just like I think like if you feel this, like you're like, okay, damn, like I really want to like, get involved. Like, okay, so like ask yourself like next, like where do you want to know? Like, what do you want to know? Do you want to know about, I mean, I think like AG is like talking to friends is really important. It's really great. Talk to friends, talk to people if you have them. But like, okay, like, all right, well, I think evictions are really unfair. Like look up how evictions work in your city. Like, yeah, like learn how to like do plumbing. Like you can start learning stuff now. Learn, or maybe you're interested in like the movements that have happened in your city. Like start doing some research, like find out what's been going on. Like, or even most recently, like reach out to people like me. Like also just like, don't be scared to like just ask people questions. Like ask people, talk to people. Most of the like good organizers I know, like they just are not afraid to like talk to random people. They're like an embarrassing mom at the mall, you know, or whatever, like just like talking to whoever. Like
I'm
that's
so
actually
glad you asked.
yeah, that's an organizing skill. And like whatever, and like I don't worship organizing. Like I think there's a lot of problems with the way we think about organizing and activism, but a lot of those problems are like think, because we don't think about what we want to see in the world. Okay, like I want to see a world without homeless people. Okay, that's like very dramatic. That's like a lot. That's a big ask. How do I get there? That's so overwhelming. Like, okay, like I don't want to see it on, you know, in this neighborhood in my city. Like what's being done in my neighborhood? Are there organizations? Are there, you know, like just like try to like think about how the problem you want to address manifests itself locally, and look into that and look into what's going on. And you'll probably find almost certainly that there are people around you who are also paying attention and who also want it to change, and meet those people. And they might not be in an organization. The best ones probably aren't. They might not necessarily be already connected. So which can be intimidating and hard to find, especially as you said, during a pandemic. So like, again, I don't know, this is all very theoretical and like, you know,
I think that's great. I think right, the
yeah.
scale your question or your intervention, and local is like, yeah, it makes total sense for that.
Yeah.
So I think let's do two more questions. One is really related to this, and then we're gonna have Thomas ask us a question vocally to wrap us up.
Okay.
So yeah, so related to what you're talking about this idea of kind of having capital O organizers that, I mean, besides causing maybe a bunch of sort of tactical and strategic problems that, you know, we've touched on earlier today, also, as you were just mentioning, sort of like can make it for people who don't feel organically like a part of a movement yet, or are not connected to an org, that can feel like, oh, that's not me. And when in reality, of course, like that's not an enshrined category of person. So we have a great question, which is that you mentioned that a big hurdle in the encampment movement was the ways in which organizers were tempted to still turn it into a bureaucracy, manage it, etc. How do you think this is preventable, other than people's consciousness changing and seeing people as individuals and not patronizing them?
Yeah, I mean, it's hard, right? People want to be helpful. I think all those people want to help. But they also want to be seen to be helping. And it's that second part that really makes people dangerous, in my experience. Wanting to be like connecting your identity to being someone who helps is dangerous. That's even more abstract than what you suggested. Practical ways that we can do it. Okay, I think one thing that can happen is early on, principles of solidarity for the space. So for example, no one is evicted, right? No one can be evicted. There aren't formal roles. Would be something that you can do. So I want to talk about like how this sort of happens, right? One of the ways this happens is, okay, so there's a ton of donations flowing in. You've got this encampment, you've caught the wave of a big social movement. All of a sudden there's all these donations, there's tent stuff coming in, all this stuff coming in. You're an organizer, you want to help. You see this big pile of stuff. You think, what I can do is manage the stuff. I can figure out everything that we have. Suddenly, like within a few days, suddenly there's an organization, there's people who are checking in all the stuff that comes in and out, who are deciding whether or not someone can get a tent or can get materials. Or, there's a problem like, you're dealing with unhoused folks who haven't had access to a lot. So like suddenly there's like a big tent full of supplies and like there's stealing happening. And you try to solve the stealing by like managing it. And like, the way you think about the stealing is like, okay, like we need to like, watch it. We need to have someone outside the tent where the stuff is all the time, right? We need to lock it with a key. And then like you're immediately thinking like a bureaucrat because your concern is, how do we stop this thing that I see that's disorganizing from happening? How do I manage the situation that's already ongoing? Rather than like taking an attitude of like, okay, like this is how it works. How can I plug into it? Like it's not your job to like change everything and fix everything. We can't do that. And what we can do is like meet one another, talk to one another, build relationships, figure out what other people want. I think like a way to avoid this is to not focus on stuff. Focusing on stuff is a really fast way to produce a bureaucracy. We need stuff. We need food. We need tents. We need, if we're doing an encampment, we need the stuff. Don't focus on managing the stuff. The stuff will come or it won't. If we need it, a lot of what people end up doing is like, okay, we're getting a lot of donations now, but what happens when those donations run out? We got to manage it now. It's like, no. We have stuff now, so we don't have to worry about stuff. We can start worrying about like what we're doing politically. Why are we here? What are we doing? What do people know? Ask like just like abstracting from the questions of stuff and management as much as possible, avoiding those questions as much as possible. Okay, like instead of saying like I've seen a lot of activists be like, I don't feel that safe here, we need a security team. And they disavow the first part of that, which is that I don't feel safe. And they pretend that other people don't feel safe, that it's not a safe space. This is very abstract, but one thing that I think people who stick in, organizing, activism, revolutionary stuff for the long haul, one thing that they get good at is recognizing, I'm not comfortable with this. I need to figure out how to be comfortable, or I need to figure out what's going on, rather than I'm not comfortable. Everyone must be uncomfortable. I have to fix the situation that produced uncomfortableness, right? And like that's how you get burnt out, because like especially if you're running a unhoused, a homeless encampment, you cannot. I mean, if you're trying to run it, you're already fucked. But like if you're trying to keep it unchaotic, you are doomed. Like one of the reasons Occupy ICE in 2018 worked so well was because the people who wanted it to not be chaotic burnt out really fast, like in a week. They were gone. And then the people who just like were vibing, like stuck around, and like it stayed messy. It never got unmessy, but we got wins because people are messy and lives are messy. It's never going to be clean. It's never going to look as nice as a Target fucking aisle. It's never going to be that well organized. You are never going to be in a space that looks what capitalism describes success as, because that's actually inhuman, bureaucratic, and fucking propertarian and probably racist. Like, so like what success is going to look like for us is going to be messy and weird and difficult. And sometimes that hurts, and your hurt is real and it needs to be addressed and you need to take it seriously, but also you can't control the mess. but what the mess can do is we can use that mess to like push in certain directions. We can push the big mess onto their doorstep and make them fucking deal with it. Or we can try and like solve the mess ourselves. And like in my experience, people solving the mess leads to burnout, and it leads to this like bad activism-ism. Again, that's a very like vague, I guess these are all vague philosophies. If there was an easy solution, I wish I had it. I would be so great. I've like never been able to stop it. So this is just the things that occur to me. This thing this summer, like we got big wins. Like we had that stuff happen and there were still big wins. So it's not the end of the world if those kind of structures start to form. They do tend to alienate people. They do tend to create a division between one thing that happens that sorry, and then I'll stop. Sorry, I know I'm going on and on. One thing that happens a lot is people make a distinction between volunteers and residents really hard and fast. Oh, well, what do residents want? This is a way actually to disembody and take away the voice of residents, weirdly, because then you can always make a moral claim that you have to listen to the residents, the volunteers. This happened a lot this summer. The volunteers need to listen to the residents. Okay, well, I like this resident's politics, so that's the resident we need to listen to, right? Like we've all encountered some version of that dynamic. So I think like trying to avoid putting hard roles on people, even as simple as resident or volunteer, trying to avoid doing some of that role creation as much as possible is important for not falling into these traps.
Wow. There was so much there. I'm facilitating this conversation and like glad that it's going to be recorded because I need to re-listen to that and like absorb.
I'm so glad it feels helpful. It's a decade of suffering at protest encampments that has given me that. So
and now
I'm glad it was for something.
To us all. Yeah, exactly. Okay, so our finale question from Thomas. I'm going to ask them to unmute, and then we can bid our farewells for now.
Yeah, I think sort of my question comes off of that really well, which is that situations in which we're able to maintain the wins. You talked about the risk of losing sort of wins because there wasn't a force to hold it there. How do you maintain a force that keeps these things, makes these promises kept without turning into a nonprofit? And not like, Vicky, I need the answer, I'm writing it down. Like, Vicky, what are strategies that you have seen employed in the universe to like keep that tension like hot and powerful and active? I am taking because it's just important to take notes.
Thank you, Thomas. Amazing question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, that's the $1 million question, isn't it? I think, I certainly in my lifetime, like I said, I haven't seen it really happen. I haven't seen that succeed in my lifetime. And I don't think we've seen it mostly fail in the history of revolution. Like, that's what the Bolsheviks were doing in theory. That's what the Chinese Communist Party was doing in theory, was creating a system that would hold those victories in place. Like, I think ultimately those victories are held in place by destroying the system, like by a revolutionary transformation, which is a very, very unsatisfying answer to me personally. And as I hear myself saying it, I think, I also think that like as we move forward, like we're going to get more and more wins like this, and we're going to start experimenting and learning ways that this can sort of hold and snowball and like grow. And like I think we're in a place right now where those questions are like really, really good, and answering them is on the horizon, but I don't think we have answers yet, Thomas. And like I think it's like really important that like we I think the thing that has seemed important and valuable to me so far is like trying to keep your eye on what got you there in the first place, and like why you started moving in the first place. I think what happens to a lot of people who de-radicalize or who become nonprofits or whatever is like they make small compromises at first, and they make a bunch of small compromises, and then they're like sort of their livelihood depends on them making a bunch of small compromises, and they keep making these small compromising, and then eventually like they're someone they would have railed against 10 years ago, right? And that sucks, and it's painful to watch, and I've seen it happen to friends, and like it sucks. And like I think what we can do is become more shrill and uncompromising. I think we need to be less reasonable. I think we need to be less willing to accept victories. And I don't mean like claim no easy victory. I mean that sort of like cute activist thing. Like, no, like we need to be really, really unreasonable about what we want, because what we want is a world in which everyone has enough to eat and everyone lives inside. That's incredibly reasonable. To get there, until we have that, we must remain as unreasonable as possible. Again, that's just rephrasing. The answer is revolution in a different way. But I do think like, there is we are human beings, we are animals moving through a horrifying and unjust world, trying our best, trying to make the world work for us and for the people we love and the people around us. And it's very tempting in the face of that to get a certain place and stop and defend. Very, very understandable, very tempting to want to withdraw from some of this stuff to some extent. Love and recognize the part of you that's scared and that wants to withdraw and that wants to stop as well. One way to not stop is to love the part of you that wants to stop and to listen to it and to really like think about why you need to stop right now. If any of us, God forbid, anyone on this call was to die tomorrow, hopefully the revolution would still be possible. We all believe that, right? The movement does not rely on any one of us. But like we can all put our shoulder to the wheel and push. That's the whatever. I'm using another Marxist term, but that's the contradiction, right? Like that's the dialectic. That like no individual is necessary and every individual can contribute and become necessary. So like taking that really seriously and being as loving to your friends and the people and trying to create relationships and relations and ways of being together that emphasize that vulnerability and that softness and that animalness and that unreasonableness and that care, while also being absolutely fucking uncompromising towards our enemies. If you can figure out that balance, like you're on the good path. Yeah.
Oh my gosh, that was just the most brilliant note to end on. Vicky, thank you so much. Thanks to everybody for your questions, and sorry to those that we didn't get to. Be more shrill. That's like,
yeah, be more shrill. I'm trying to bring it back. Thank you.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay, Andrew, do you want to wrap us up?
Thanks again, Vicky. You know, I thought that was just such a great talk. Maybe just on that last point, a good piece to affirm is the importance of revolutionary education and outreach, and this type of event where people can learn from each other's experience and knowledge and learn, find new forms of solidarity. Like I, definitely felt that in terms of learning more about struggles in Philadelphia. And so for anybody on the call or in the group, who wants to lead a class or get involved, I definitely encourage you to stick around and talk. And yeah, Vicky, thanks again.
Yeah, and thank you all so much. Thanks for the Parkdale Free School. You guys are so cool. I love what you're doing, and it was such an honor to be welcomed into your space and listened to for all this time. And yeah, thank you all. Thank you all again.
Thanks, Vicky.
All right, so yeah, we'll be sticking around if anybody has any questions about the free school or the land trust or anything like that. And I just got a question. Will this be on YouTube? Yes, it is being recorded. So I will have to figure out the logistics of that. There have been several issues around just having something stream on YouTube, but I'm sure we can figure it out. So yeah, I'll give it a few minutes for people to ask any questions in the chat. I'll check the Facebook group in case anybody has anything. And if people need to leave, have a great night.